short presentations, followed then by, time permitting, a couple of questions from the audience to the panelists. Lastly, feel free to share this event on social media, hashtag offshore RenEU. We will show it to you afterwards. And lastly, we would, I think the question was already asked, we would like to remind you that this session will indeed be recorded. Voila. That being said, let's go right into the first session. The first session will look into the double challenge, how we can scale up the investment to the necessary extent. And as we've heard from Paula in the beginning, we're talking about really a step change, if you like, in investment, multiplying currently installed capacity by a factor of between 10 and 20. So it is really not incremental, but it is a change in substance, in dimension, I would say. And that triggers the second challenge, which is how to integrate all these additional renewable resources into the energy system in a manner that is also cost efficient. We're going to look at these both challenges in the first panel today. It's hence with great pleasure that I welcome two speakers from the generation side, two from the network side, and one from the financial side. Let me then just first check quickly whether everybody is, all panelists are with us. So the first panelist is Ivan Pineda, Director of Public Affairs from Wind Europe. Ivan, can you hear us?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Jahim. I can hear you. Can you?
Super. Excellent. Good morning. I can hear and see you. Welcome. We are also joined by Rémi Gruet, who is Chief Executive Officer of Ocean Energy Europe, so representing the other technologies which are relevant in this discussion. Rémi, can you hear us?
Good morning, Joachim. Yeah, I can hear you.
I'm
good.
Good morning. Then we will be joined by Antje Orts from NSOE, from Offshore Core Group.
Good morning, everyone. I can hear you properly. Thank you.
We have with us Alexander Helmedak, Head of Primary Equipment Offshore from Amprion.
Good morning, everybody. I can hear you. Unfortunately, I don't have video, but it works, the audio.
Okay, good. That's fine. And then finally, we have Alessandro Izzo, who's Head of Project Finance and Regulated Operations, Western Europe at the European Investment Bank.
Good morning, Joachim.
Good morning, Alessandro. Perfect. So everybody's here. Excellent. Then without further ado, I hand over the floor to Ivan Pineda from Wind Europe. Can I ask all panelists to limit their introduction to around about 7-8 minutes, so that we have at least a few minutes left for questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jahim, and good morning, everyone. Thank you to the European Commission for organizing this stakeholder webinar, and thank you for inviting Wind Europe to share our views. We represent the offshore wind industry in Europe, which employs 300,000 people, 33,000 of them directly in the offshore wind energy industry. So in the introduction, we heard that Europe wants to become climate neutral by 2050, and offshore wind can be at the core of delivering on such climate change mitigation ambitions. The long-term strategy of the European Commission envisages anything between the 230, 240 gigawatts to up to 450 gigawatts of offshore wind in 2050. So if we can go to the first slide, please. So the immense wind energy resource that we have at seas demands that we have an ambitious EU-wide coordinated and long-term approach. We think that the European Commission proposal in the autumn for the offshore renewable energy strategy should be the blueprint for such an ambitious approach. Next slide. Today, we have around 23 gigawatts of offshore wind. In Europe, that meets about only 2% of our electricity demand. By 2030, this could be up to 106 gigawatts if the governments follow through and meet their pledges in the national energy and climate plans. Next slide. So how can we reach the 20 times increase in capacity? Next slide, please. Well, if we continue to build today as we are building today offshore wind, the path to get to 2050 won't be enough. Next slide. There are already good processes in place that we are having, such as maritime spatial planning, that is allocating space. We are already aligning certain processes at European level, particularly with regional cooperation mechanisms. Last week, the ministers of the North Seas energy countries met and they start looking into synergies to deploy offshore wind energy. And we are seeing that there is already interest to deploy the first cross-border projects and having final investment decisions of such projects by mid-20s. But if we continue in that way, next slide, please, it won't be enough. It won't be enough to meet the volumes that we are envisaging. So we need to do something different. We need to change the approach. Next slide, please. If we want to correct the path for growth, we need to start acting already now. We need to increase the rate of deployment for offshore wind towards 2050. And that includes that in maritime spatial planning, the process that today is between every 6 and 10 years needs to be done on a basin level, on a sea basin level. It cannot be only done at a national level. And there will be extremely important decisions that we need to make when it comes to happy coexistence. And this is because offshore wind can and should be sharing the sea with many other uses at the different levels of economic activity. That includes fisheries, that includes the military, defense sector, aviation, and of course, environmental protection and biodiversity protection. But what we need to do also is to gear up the supply chain. We need investments. The current capacity of the offshore wind industry in Europe is about delivering 7 gigawatts a year. If we are going to increase by 20 times, we need to significantly make investments within the next 5 to 10 years, and at least have the visibility for 10 years more so that we can depreciate such investments. And importantly, we cannot connect 450 gigawatts, one wind farm with one cable to one market. We need what we call offshore hybrid projects, which is connecting larger clusters of wind farms to several markets, 2 or more, by the means of interconnectors. Next slide, please. So here are 5 things that we recommend to the European Commission for enabling the ramp up of increasing activity in offshore wind. National energy and climate plans need to come and have a very detailed level of policies that enable the volumes to be met. We need to have ambitious 2030 greenhouse gas energy targets. And importantly, we need to ensure that we have renewables-based electrification agenda. Next slide, please. When it comes to maritime spatial planning, what you see in this map is the overlapping of all the areas according to the wind speed and all the other uses that we have. What we need to do is to mainstream the climate maritime spatial planning and position offshore wind as a natural resource at the same level as other resources that we have at sea, such as oil and gas, such as fisheries. We need to ensure that because offshore is the last user to come to the sea, one to be allocated space. We need multi-stakeholder regional cooperation and multiple uses of offshore wind farms too. Next slide. Importantly, the Commission has mentioned that deploying offshore and onshore grid is extremely important. We have this immense resource at sea and we need to bring it to the centers of consumption and to those users that will demand this electricity. We would like the Commission to propose a master plan for the grid, both onshore and offshore grid, because as I mentioned, we cannot simply connect the increased amount of offshore wind in the way that we are doing. Importantly, we need an enabling framework for offshore hybrids. Next slide, please. And that includes having a legal clarity for these assets that are both an offshore wind farm and an interconnector. We need to have clarity about the processes for auctioning such projects. The master plan needs to be done centrally with the European Commission in command. And we want to make sure that we work on the demonstration of large-scale HVDC interoperability at sea. Next slide. The offshore strategy needs also to maintain the first mover advantage. Europe is already a worldwide leader in the technology. We need to ensure that that remains in the future, that we unlock the supply chain investments in all the regions, that renewables is included as a strategic supply chain and as a strategic sector by belonging to an industrial forum. We want that we have an export strategy for renewables likewise. Next slide. Last, but probably not least, and the Commission has already presented yesterday the so awaited energy system integration strategies and hydrogen strategies. We need hydrogen to be renewable if we want to meet our climate ambitions. To that end, we want 5 things for the European Commission that were well explained in the strategies and also need to be reinforced in the offshore strategy. Set a clear definition of all the sources for hydrogen, scale up electrolyzers. We need to ensure that the hydrogen that is going to be produced is clearly traceable. We want to know from where it's coming from. We want to make sure that because we are doing hydrogen, we also invest heavily on the grids to connect wind energy to those electrolyzers. And of course, we want to ensure that renewable hydrogen done by wind and solar is prioritized in the agenda. With that, I want to conclude my remarks. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ivan. So after having heard from the offshore wind industry, which is, of course, at the moment, in quantitative terms, vastly the, let's say, the most relevant one, it's more than appropriate that we turn to other technologies which are coming up, as it were, and which have the potential to be very important complements to offshore wind in the overall portfolio of technologies. And for that, I would hand over now to Rémi Cruet, CEO of Ocean Energy Europe.
Thank you, Joachim. Good morning, everybody. Indeed, we know that wind and solar are the big things in energy at the moment, but we hope very much that oceans can be the next big thing in energy. Next slide, please. For those of you who don't know us, Ocean Energy Europe is, just like Wind Europe, a trade association representing the sector, right from researchers to manufacturers of machines, project developers, utilities. We even have regions who've identified the economic benefits of developing ocean energy and who've joined us on the board of the association. Next, please. So why do we think ocean energy is the next big thing? Well, there are 3 main reasons. The first one is economic activity and recovery. We have a very similar business model to wind. We manufacture a large number of small-ish machines, smaller compared to coal plants. Obviously, still fairly big when you look at them. We believe that we can put 100 gigawatts with current technologies in Europe, and this could increase significantly if, for example, technologies with targeting ocean current and low speed flows develop, as they seem to be doing at the moment. And that could net us a new 400,000 jobs by 2050. So that's the first argument. And the second is value to the grid, because we know that wind and solar are going to be the cheapest technologies on the grid. We know that they're going to make the bulk of the electricity we produce. They already generate a huge amount. Renewables, I believe, are around 35% today of electricity generation. So to balance these variable renewables, you will need everything you can get your hands on. So it's energy efficiency, it's storage, it's demand response, and it's every other renewables we can actually have. Tidal is 100% predictable, so it's very good for grid management perspective. Wave has a different advantage. It produces basically still after the wind stops. The waves are built up by the wind. These are the waves we use. And when the wind stops and the turbines from event stop, the wave devices keep continuing for a number of hours, which obviously helps smoothing up the peaks of productions and having a more stable grid. The final point, final point is that just like with wind, offshore wind, we have a technological advantage in tidal and wave and OTEC, and we can use that to control and hopefully dominate the market around the world. And I want for proof that right now, where we're only at demonstration stage, every project we know of outside of Europe is actually using European technology, except in China, even though, I mean, you could say they're using old European technology, but they didn't really pay for it, but that's a different topic. Next slide, please. So I want to show you a few of the demonstration projects that are in the water. This one's been in the water for 4 years. It's Atlantis, a Scottish project, 6 megawatt, has been running quite well and has produced a large amount of gigawatt hours already. As you can see, it's very much an onshore wind turbine underwater, or an offshore one. The blades are much smaller, but it's a similar technology. Next, please. This is a slightly different one. You still can see the 3-bladed turbines. You have 4 of them, 2 are already underwater. This is a floating concept. It's an Austrian company that partnered with the British manufacturer of platforms and manufactured their turbines in Germany, and is currently installing them in Canada. So you can already see the export factor here and the wide range of opportunities for different European countries, including countries like Austria, who are landlocked, in fact. Next, please. Moving to wave, and Core Power will be presenting a bit later today, so I'm not going to tell you everything about this, but this is a buoy type device, which is pulling up a cable as it goes up and down in the waves. And this is how they generate electricity. So this is one of the concepts that is currently developing successfully. And next, please. We have a few others in wave because they are targeting different resources, different types of resources, and also simply because the consolidation that already happened in tidal hasn't quite finished yet in wave. So this is a different device. The water comes in from the right side through these openings, and it pushes air in. It's a project that has been conceived by an Irish company. They built it in the US and they're installing it in Hawaii. And the next project they want to do is going to be built in Poland. So as you can see, again, we are fairly international here. Next, please. Now, all of these projects are demonstration projects. Tidal has demonstration farms in the water already. It's putting more and it's waiting for a few more farms, but it's essentially ready to scale up. Wave has full-scale devices in the water. We're testing them, we're validating them. It's just behind Tidal, and we'll be looking at demonstration farm very soon. So this is what we're trying to fix, and what we're hoping with the strategy to see fixed is this commercial value of death issue. Next, please. Because demonstration projects have a number of advantages. For starters, they deliver dramatic cost reductions. This is really why we need them. The European Commission's Joint Research Center published an analysis last year showing that the cost of tidal over these projects has actually reduced by 40% in the last 4 years. So this is obviously very dramatic, and we will continue with larger number of units put in the water. Next, please. Also, across the few megawatts, I want to say, that we have in the water, you can see here the supply chain that has already been developed. It's very significant. It's across the entire coastline, but it's also within the country. As the component and the supply chains develop, and as the targets and the units in the water increase, you will see a lot more of that supply chain popping up. But this is already a quite significant map for about maybe 60 megawatts of total installed capacity in Europe. Next, please. Last but not least, a big advantage of demonstration projects is that they generate data. They prove the machines can work, and they generate investor confidence. This is just a picture of the gigawatt hours that have been produced in Europe in the last few years. And you can see it's ramping up nicely, and we very much hope it's going to continue so exponentially. Investors' confidence is hugely important to go and get access to private money. And this is a bit where I'm going to go with our recommendations for the strategy. Next, please. Because how do we get there? How do we get the next farms in the water, and how do we scale up and reach commercialization? Well, we think the offshore strategy can be the perfect tool for that by setting objectives and setting actions to deliver those objectives. So in terms of the objectives, we've put forward three. One, which is short-term, because we need the short-term impetus. 100,000 homes powered by ocean energy. Sounds like a lot, but is in fact equivalent to about 100 megawatts in the water, so very reasonable amounts. By 2030, already a ramp up to 3 gigawatts, both wave and tidal, probably more tidal, but still both technologies. And by 2050, obviously 100 gigawatts of blue energy. Next, please. So to reach these objectives, we need a number of actions. And the advantage I have is that Ivan already presented, and most of the actions Ivan presented, we also require, we need them, and we support them. So thank you, Ivan. You've done half my presentation for me. I'm going to focus on the part that we need crucially to get these farms in the water, which is financing for demonstration projects. Next, please. The key part of financing new technologies is revenue support. Wind got it, solar got it, nuclear is getting it right now for Hinkley Point. Have a nice feed-in tariff, higher than offshore wind, in fact. There is a need to close the financial gap with revenue support. The electricity price is way too low everywhere in Europe at the moment. To build renewables in general, ocean energy in general, but to be honest, to build a number of other things as well. Next, please. Thank you. Next to revenue support, the other thing that is required is investment help. And the reason behind that is that currently to build a tidal farm, you will have about 50% of your cost, which will be pure financing costs. It's going to be the dividend, the interest that the banks or your equity providers are requiring. Because the technology is still young, it's innovative, these interest rates and equity returns are very high. So having schemes like Horizon 2020, like the Innovation Fund, or like Inofin EDP, which can provide grants or public finance in the form of equity or loan at a low rate, can simply divide the cost of these next projects by 2. This is really very significant. Obviously, the industry has an interest in reducing costs via technology improvements, via operation and maintenance improvements, but there is an easy way we can reduce costs today, and that's by providing public finance into those projects. Which brings me to my last point. Next, please. An insurance and guarantee fund, because as I said, these projects are innovative. So if you go to a bank and you say, can you insure my turbines, please? They will look at it and will say, well, how many of those turbines have you already put in the water? Can I technically trust that they're going to perform the way you say they are going to perform? And the answer is not always 100% yes. So there are uncertainties because we are in the middle of innovating, because we change and improve things with each machine. So an insurance and guarantee fund is a new idea of a fund that doesn't exist yet at European level that could benefit several technologies. I'm pretty sure then floating wind would be interested. I know for a fact that geothermal energies would be interested as well. It's basically enables you to insure some of the risks of projects and as a result to lower the cost of your capital, which means again, as a result that you also can lower the support that you need to provide on top of the electricity price. So there are a few ideas. We've put a number of others in papers which are at your disposal. And I will stop here with my last slide, which is about technology that is exploiting low speed currents I was mentioning earlier and making great strides at the moment and could basically blow up the 100 gigawatt mark that I have put in my first slides for ocean resource in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, for this interesting presentation. You touched already upon the financing aspects, and we get back to that with the last speaker in this panel. But before we turn to the EIB, we have 2 speakers from the network side, and hence I would now like to hand over the floor to Antje Orts from NSOE to give us the perspective of the TSOs. Antje, please.
Okay, thank you, Joachim. Yes, for those, thank you also for inviting us. That's a big honor for us to speak here and to show what we are thinking about offshore development. So for those who are not familiar with what is NSOE, so we are the European Network of Transmission System Operators for Electricity, and we have 42 member companies and from 35 countries. Next slide. As such, we are aware of the challenges ahead, and they are well presented by Ivan. Thank you for this. And so this has various components, and they all are related to our activities. So our activities, they comprise system development, market design, operation of the system, and also research to enhance the system. Everything is, you can say, is summarized in the heading you see, which is our role is to plan and operate the system. What we, among others, do in planning is, you might already know, so we produce every 2 years the 10-year network development plan, and you can see a picture of the last edition from 2018 on the right-hand side, where we publish our perspective up to 2040, 2050. So the name is a bit misleading. We look far further than just 10 years ahead. So for us, it's essential that we apply a holistic view across time, space, and sectors, and otherwise we might end up with inefficiencies or tremendous investment, which of course should be avoided. This view is our, you can say, natural way of planning the system, and thus offshore is just one out of multiple aspects we consider. Usually we consider all fuel types and developments, and there are huge developments all over Europe. So offshore is one important aspect, but not the only one. So, however, the role of offshore will be growing, and flows across the system will change, and finally all countries, even those without any common coast, will be impacted. Therefore, it's essential that on and offshore systems are planned under one roof, and so as they will operate afterwards as one big system also. Yeah, today, you might know, we are connected from Finland to Portugal, and we build and operate lines on and offshore already, and thus we support in general the application of the same rules on as well as offshore. Next slide. So this applies, for example, to very basic rules like the ones fixed in the 90s. The unbundling between generation, transport, and trade of electricity. And we think the same should, of course, be applied offshore, as it's fundamental to ensure neutrality, non-discrimination, fair competition, and security of supply. We actively support multilateral cooperation between member states, TSOs, and stakeholders. Latest example, the meeting of NSEC, where the ministers meet on Monday. It was Monday, even not last week, and we agreed on the way forward. In NSOE, we TSOs collaborate across Europe. So we plan the system and we collaborate also with stakeholders and also send our products in consultation to them. In view of the gigawatts offshore ahead, we recently published a position paper, which you can see on the screen to the right-hand side. You can find it on our homepage. And this summarizes our views on challenges and main pillars. Here we repeat, among others, our request that anticipatory investments should be supported by our regulators, and it should be compatible across different member states in order to facilitate cross-border investments and related necessary onshore infrastructure. This is necessary as lead time for offshore generation and offshore infrastructure differ hugely. So that means that careful planning is necessary, and sometimes from our side preparatory work is needed as generation that comes later. So here again, the work of NSEC is valuable as maritime spatial planning and calls for tenders can be, and they are already coordinated there. And so this, we think, is good for the supply chain as they have to deliver increased number of projects. Related to market design, in NSOE, we currently work on a second position paper comparing the so-called home market solution versus offshore bidding zones under the current regulation. And so far, our findings point towards offshore bidding zones as the most promising solution. We have looked into market design efficiency aspects as roles and responsibility, scalability or compatibility with the 70% rule and other things. We have also looked into operational aspects, as for example, demand for redispatch and counter trading. In parallel, of course, we are aware that this needs to be aligned with policy objectives. And there we see some open questions for policymakers to be solved. So the central question, of course, is how the impact of different market revenues for offshore developers can be solved and who pays what. Another open question is the allocation of CO2 credits for multinational setups, just to name two. Next slide. In our position paper, we also mentioned technical challenges. It will be essential that HVDC of different vendors can operate together so that we have so-called plug-and-play solutions. So usually different vendors don't exchange their models. Of course, they have business secrets, but we TSOs can make important contributions towards interoperability by applying all models and providing system studies. This will then guarantee a long-term sustainable system with high reliability and acceptable risk mitigation. We did already standardize some solutions, contributing, driving the cost down, and we will further continue. So to name some examples, this is about transmission capacities or offshore inter-array connection voltages, for example. We also have built already some innovative grid solutions, such as deliver the proof that we don't stand still. So, for example, some hubs collecting several offshore wind farms, or some other famous Kriegers-Flak combined grid solution, which will be the first hybrid, which will soon be commissioned. I think I stop here, and then I'm curious for your questions later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to MSOE for this presentation, to you, Antje. I'll hand over right away to the second speaker we have for today from a TSO perspective, which is Alexander Henneberg from Amprion. The floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction words. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you again and excuse myself that my camera is not working, unfortunately. I also would like to have some minutes to show you one idea of a common approach of how to create an offshore grid. We call it European Offshore Busbar, that shall be a collective initiative for future-proof European offshore infrastructure. And on the next slide, I would like to show you the motivation why we think such an initiative makes sense. It is driven by the climate goals for 2050 on European level, where the basis is to be CO2 neutral at the year 2050, and that implies some big changes in the network. One of them is to include a large share of offshore wind power, which is estimated, we have seen this before, to be 450 gigawatts. And when we look on the other side on how long it takes to realize an offshore grid connection, we see this can be 10 years or longer. And therefore, it makes sense to start early to look on how it is possible to integrate such large shares into the electricity network. Next slide, please. We see here a sketch of the North Sea and a possible way of how to integrate such large shares of offshore wind power. I would like to show you in 3 steps how this could be done. The approach in general is to move from a single offshore platform to a cross-linked system, aiming at the goal to build a network of offshore platforms on a European level. That means it's necessary to establish standards or something that could be called a European offshore plug, and then this could bring benefits to utilize the wind energy that's spread over the seas, meaning that we have synergy effects, but also we have anti-correlation effects, making it easier to integrate such large shares into the electricity network. Then we would be able to supply industrial locations with the wind energy, and we would try to optimize at the same time the electricity system, not only like it's classically done on land, but also on sea. when we look to other energy domains, we see that considering sector coupling makes sense to have an overall system optimization, and that the best example for that is hydrogen. So if we look on the map, we see in yellow possible wind energy integration lines. We see in purple HVDC corridors, here shown in Germany, here shown in Germany, and also demand for hydrogen. When I start at step 1, that would be the integration of offshore wind energy based on the national planning processes, and then going into step 2, which is on the next slide, to interconnect those offshore grid systems within the national zones at the sea, so to build up an international offshore link, building up a small portion of the entire grid that can be acted and investigated as a demonstrator, and then moving at step 3, which is on the next slide, to the international connection of the offshore grid system, connecting all the different countries and being able to lift all the benefits that I pointed out before. The key principles shown on the next slide of such an approach would be that, as I have shown in the different steps, we have a modular approach. That means the system can be expanded step by step based on existing proven processes, that we do have a fallback option as we go step by step, and we are able down the road to include the latest state-of-the-art technology and to so-called update the system. The second pillar is that we would like to have a one system view, meaning, as I said before, to have a system-oriented optimization and that kicks off from day one, a standardization process which is necessary, being able to create the interface definitions to later plug and play the system. Third point is, and probably most important, the idea is to build, as was said in the previous presentation, a collective approach where all involved stakeholders sit at one table, at one forum to discuss the regulatory and technical questions and to address all the different issues, to be able to do a joint implementation of such an idea by all the international stakeholders which are involved. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you a lot for your attention, and at the end of the session, I'm open to feedback questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alexander, for this presentation. And now it's time to come to indeed the perspective, to come back to the perspective of financing. And for that, I'm very glad that we have with us today Alessandro Izzo from the European Investment Bank. Alessandro, the screen is yours, please.
Okay, thanks a lot, Joachim, and good morning, everybody. Thanks to DJ Energy for the invitation to the very interesting webinar. It's really a welcome opportunity to share and change ideas on this fundamental topic for I would say European industry development. As you briefly introduced, I'm heading the project finance and regulated operations lending activities of the European Investment Bank, with a focus on the Western European market. So my team, together with other smaller geographical teams in the bank, is the main responsible for origination, analyzing, and underwriting project finance and corporate debt solution, which have supported and will continue supporting offshore wind deployment in Europe. Next slide, please. My presentation will fundamentally address what are perceived the key enabling factors from a debt investor's perspective to deployment of large-scale offshore wind investments. So to address, Joachim, your question, how do we enable the scale-up of offshore investments by 20, 30 times what has been deployed so far? We saw also the figure put forward by Ivan, Wind Europe, which lay ahead the immense, I would say, challenge for the industry. Figures are impressive and require all parties and players to act accordingly to the challenge. For this purpose, I will use some slides where I will give a bit of an introduction on the EIB institutional activity, track record in the sector, but most significantly, I will focus on the perspectives for the challenges laying ahead for the sectors. Next slide, please. Next slide. I assume, and I will not spend too much time on discussing the EIB and its institutional role within the EU. I would just highlight one fundamental element of institutional development. We can move to the next slide, please. Whereby the EIB, at the end of 2019, by decision of its board of directors, has fully endorsed the EU Green Agenda of the Commission, accepting to become the EU Climate Bank, which eventually turns into 3 hard commitments in terms of policy goals. A mobilization of 1 trillion investments, green investments by 2030, increasing the climate finance and environment component of EIB lending to 50% of yearly activities by 2030, and then ensuring that all EIB lending activities, also not related to climate and environment, are fully Paris aligned by 2020, by the end of this year. So in a nutshell, these goals strengthen even further EIB commitment to supporting offshore wind development in Europe. Next slide, please. Historically, the EIB has been one of the early believers in the sector. So far, we've supported with both project finance and corporate debt solution, very long list and plenty of projects in all European jurisdictions. We started in the early days in Denmark, UK, and Germany, followed practically the full market development in certain jurisdictions, and we're also active in the latest market entrants like Portugal and France. Across all technologies, we've been supporting the whole deployment and followed interesting industry developments on deployment of fixed bottom, and we've also been supporting some of the earlier floating and currently supporting the deployment of the various projects active in France. The bank is really willing to step up its commitment in the sector and continue to support towards the leap forwards to 2030 and beyond targets. Next slide, please. Slide. So cracking on the key point fundamentally, which is how do we ensure that the massive challenge ahead is actually met by the industry, and I speak both equally of industrial players and equity and debt providers to the industry. Fundamentally, what the industry has experienced is a migration and reduction of LCOEs that have rendered the business case for offshore investment stronger and stronger. This is key. Is key element that needs to be preserved and maintained. The good news is that LCOEs continue to be on the decreasing trend, but again, this is not definitely one point, and it needs to be maintained as the fundamental banking case, at least for these type of assets. The sector remains characterized by certain uncertainties, which could affect in the mid and long term its competitiveness. The technology risk remains high. Offshore works in an operation in maritime environments, as well as fast technological developments, which enable the scale up of the deployment, remain on the high end of the risk spectrum of renewables and more generally infra investments. Projects experience a continuous greater exposure to risk of electricity pricing in an environment where fundamentally prices are characterized by being low end, and these against earlier alternative solutions where full revenue stabilization has certainly provided support to the industry. So further renewable generation introduced in grids and cannibalization of this type of energy generation on prices, the economic case for investment can become shakier if appropriate policy support is not introduced. New markets open up, which is great news. At the same time, regulatory regimes which are untested come to market, and new entrants also make their ways in the sector. The supply chain, we heard already that it's a fundamental element of equation for success of the deployment of offshore in the future. It's already facing challenges in terms of scaling up to the scaling up commitments, and also compression of margins and competition in the sector create further stress. Last but not least, we believe that the sector needs to maintain and remain with a balanced risk-return proposition, which will enable channeling of resources both from equity and debt investors alike to efficiently reach the investments. Next slide, please. Next slide. So next slide. Yeah. So what is key to preserve a favorable investment environment in the sector? We would say that fundamentally sound risk allocation is crucial, and adequate de-risking of project components instrumental to optimize cost of debt raised is the other great enabler. This allows an impact more generally on WACC, which will remain on the lower end, and so LCOEs will continue their path to reduction with strong business case for offshore investment valid. We identified some key risk elements in investment proposition for offshore. Some of these have been or will be touched upon by other panelists in their interventions. I would most conscious of time, and will principally focus on two elements: revenues and project contracting. On revenues, it's clear, and nobody can deny that the remarkable decline of LCOEs for the industry has been a combination of technological industrial development, but certainly also a clear containment of financing cost for these type of assets. So with certain markets moving in the direction of limited and no revenue support, there is some doubt that investment volumes are expected to be raised the coming decade beyond will be there and available. So whilst it's welcome, the debate is welcome on the most efficient support scheme, moving from pure subsidies to revenue stabilization measures, two-sided CFDs, low price support. In any case, it's quite fundamental and crucial to the industry that thought to sustain revenue support for the investment case of offshore is retained. There are market solutions available there, like corporate PPAs, but these have inherent limitations in terms of tenors or depth of the market, which fundamentally mean they could coexist with and part of support schemes, but they will not be providing a long-term solution to deployment of the volumes that we have seen. So fundamentally, the message is stable cash flows will result in lower WACCs and ensure maintenance of low LCOEs. On project contracting, we mentioned the fact that technology, construction, operational performance risk remain quite on the high-end investment proposition for offshore. These risks are typically managed by the private sector, the promoters and actors. We highlight the importance as a debt provider of an adequate and sound and resilient contracting around these risks, mitigate them. It's a bit of a reminder that, of course, optimization of contracting strategies to optimize financial structures, to aggressively bid on auctions, and it's sometimes necessary for the equity to secure the investments, but should not push extra further or unnecessarily increase construction and performance risk for non-equity investors. Again, sustainable cost of debt is key to maintain the trend of LCOEs reduction. Last point on this item, the risk proposition from a contracting viewpoint put forward to debt investor should also take into account alignment with the new technology proposed. We've seen, for example, in newer technology floating, propositions which are extremely aggressive, that probably are immediately taking up the final structuring solutions adopted for fixed bottom offshore. But again, it's pushing certain risk off to that providers, which certainly is not to the benefit of the pricing. I would then please move to the final slide for a last quick word on the importance of storage solution to further improve and strengthen the business case. I would say for renewable in general, but also for offshore penetration in grids. We note that, of course, there is some policy support across European jurisdiction for development of storage technologies. Although the policy and regulatory framework is far from being stabilized, I would say uniform, and hence there isn't really a business case of direct investment in these technologies, which is fundamentally been down for debt investors. So from a bankability perspective, the message is that in the absence of clear support schemes, wider European base, it's there is a high uncertainty to reach a meaningful scale of financing and deployment of these technologies, regardless of the solution of financing and implementation chosen, whether on a standalone basis or in combination with generation projects. So we follow with great interest the approval by the Commission, for example, of the common strategy on hydrogen, and that indeed your attention and policy support is sought for this key technological enabler for deployment of renewables in grids. I will end up here, and thank you for your attention, and I'm available to take any questions that might come from the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Alessandro, and thank you to all of our speakers, all 5 speakers. I think very interesting contributions. As is often the case, we are already a little bit over time, so in principle we should finish this session now. I want nevertheless to do one quick round of questions. I'll put one question to each of you and ask you perhaps really to limit your reply, if possible, to 1 minute so that we don't overrun too much. And I'll pick up on some of the questions we got from the audience. One question that I think I would like to ask both to Ivan and to Remy that we received is on the impact of the COVID crisis on investment in offshore projects. How has this crisis impacted the situation, and how do you see going forward? What are the expectations for developments now, perhaps over the couple of coming months in terms of the recovery? And I would add perhaps what potential do you see also from the numerous financing instruments that the Commission has proposed in its recovery proposal to help you basically out of the situation? So perhaps let's start with Ivan.
Thank you, Joachim. Very good question. Unlike onshore wind, most of the offshore wind development was relatively untouched for the COVID-19 crisis. We saw disruption, particularly for the movement of people between countries, particularly for the construction and or operation for offshore wind farms. Going forward, definitely the crisis made that many projects were delayed in terms of final investment decisions, but construction kept going in most of the countries. What we would like to see from the EU recovery strategy is to ensure that it focuses a lot on those projects that will deliver the climate change mitigation measures. Particular instruments that are going to be extremely important. There are those ones that are targeting the infrastructure needed for offshore wind to be connected to the grids, as well as those ones that could help some of the companies in the supply chain that would be struggling due to the insolvency issues that they might have had during the crisis. Remy?
Thanks, Ivan. Yeah, very similar here. We've had a number of delays in construction simply because people couldn't travel, couldn't access the workshops, couldn't be at the right number of people in the workshops. So as a result, a number of the projects that are actively in construction have been delayed, and there has been a cash burn as well, because these are small companies in a lot of cases. And the fact that the project doesn't progress means there is no influx of money into the company. And then for prospective projects, there have been delays as well because of the difficulty to reach people and make deals, with the result that there is a risk of investor loss. In fact, and some projects would be not only delayed, but basically postponed for a while. So in terms of the solutions, well, they're very much along the line of what I presented in the strategy as well. So some visibility, short-term visibility for the market via the schemes that the Commission already has available, or those towards ocean energy will be essential. A lot of flexibility would be a second point on anything that is already financed by Horizon 2020 or the European schemes. So flexibility on deadlines specifically would be required. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for these concise answers. Then the next question would be for Antje Orts from ENSOE. So there was a specific question on the role of standardization when it comes to grid technology, and I think you actually touched upon this issue, saying that indeed, I mean, TSOs should promote that basically. But the specific question was, should the EU actually enforce such standardization through regulatory means? So that standardization and interoperability, I should add. So that would be the question to you.
Yeah, good question as well. Actually, yeah, industry has its own path to ensure standardization. So there's IEA and IEEE and IEC, so I think this works well. And then what was the second part? Sorry.
Huh? Sorry, the interoperability.
Okay, yeah, yes. There we have. Thank you. Interoperability, yes, that's quite important, and there we also it would make sense if you have a look in our research and development agenda, so which also was recently published. There are several activities where we collaborate also with vendors and with T&D Europe, and among ourselves. Directly targeting at solving the interoperability issues, and so we have huge activities and foresee also future activities towards that direction. Yeah, so I think you can find something in our research and development agenda, and of course there are research projects which we will hear something about later today, and also coming future projects might help here. So it might be good that we focus to have some pilot projects where could also be onshore, where interoperability between vendors can be tested in a real life, in a real situation, large scale situation. So that might be something which could be enforced in the next 5 years.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that. I then come to Amplion. I would actually put you 2 questions, but sort of precise ones, and you can choose to which you want to answer, perhaps more detail. The first one is your concept relates to the North Sea region, as far as we can see from the map. Do you think that the same concept could be also relevant or applicable for other geographical regions in Europe? And the second one is on the busbar concept, is it compatible with existing nodes, such as the modular offshore grid of Elia in Belgium? Voilà, these are 2 questions to you. Again, with asking you to answer, if possible, in a short manner.
Yes, I will try to quickly answer both of them. First of all, the North Sea is meant to be one example, so it's not limited to that in general. Theoretically, that can be extended in analogy, put to also other areas. So that is something that we would like to find out while we are in the process of the initiative. So we are just kicking off and want to put everybody on a table to commonly discuss. And if the outcome is, it makes sense to have a larger scope and to also look at different areas, that makes sense. We just started from the Northern Sea because it's connected to looking from Germany, for example, where we could connect the offshore grid systems towards such a busbar setup. Then the second idea is, as we go, or answer to the second question, as we go step by step, we would like to establish indeed an interface that can be connected to any type of specific variation of a part of such a system, meaning that that's why it's so important to look at the standardization kickoff and to have something, I use the word European offshore plug, which should be something like a buzzword saying, so we need to define how such an interface can look like to be coupled to different ways or variants of offshore systems. So the answer would be yes, indeed.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alexander. Then lastly, we turn back to Alessandro from the EIB. And there was a question to you. You talked about offshore wind, obviously. What is your view at the EIB about wave and tidal? Is that financeable, or what is lacking to make it financeable?
Yes, thanks for the question. I think that I mean, we look favorably at that the developments in wave and tidal. Obviously, we think there is great potential there. In terms of technological and project development in the cycle, I would say, compared to offshore wind, of course, we are pretty much in an earlier stage, which means that there is a riskier proposition for investors that an equity like. This said, the bank has, together with the Commission, mandate from the Commission, a specific envelope which is dedicated to energy development projects and EDP. Which is a higher risk envelope supporting, new and earlier technological developments in technologies like this one. So, of course, we will be looking at specific and selective cases, but there is a willingness from the policy and risk-taking angle to support developments going forward in this sector.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Alessandro. And then with that, I would like to thank again all 5 speakers of this first panel, which has been very, very interesting, I think, and highlighted quite a number of challenges that I think will be interesting food for thought as we go about working on the offshore strategy. Now, having heard that indeed plans for upscaling both offshore wind, but also other ocean energy technologies are enormous. That, of course, poses immediately a question about what that means in terms of the resource available, in terms of the marine resources available, which are already used also by other interests. That's the subject of our next panel. For that, I will hand over now to my colleague Xavier Guillou from DG Mare, who will guide you through the second panel of the day. Xavier, over to you.
Thank you, Joaquin, and good morning to everyone. So my name is Xavier Guillou. I work in the Maritime Affairs and Fishery Department of the European Commission, and I'm in charge of marine renewable energy and maritime spatial planning. I would like to welcome you to this session dedicated to sustainable management of maritime space and resources. Maybe just to recall that the sea is a public domain. It is governed by public decision for the protection of the marine habitats and biodiversity, and for human activities at seas. And the development of offshore renewable is taking place in this context. And we will be discussing that with a number of speakers. Now, before I start, and for those who are just joining us now, I maybe just like to recall just some practical things. If I could ask you to mute your microphone, including for those who are following us by phone, and to keep your camera off. You can send us questions using the chat and addressing it to the moderator that will then forward them to me. So thank you to Christophe and Pablo for your support. And before I start, I would just like to ask the different speakers just to confirm their presence and just give us a few words. And I would like to start with Mr. Kai Trumpler from the German Federal Maritime and Hydrographic Agency, BSH. Kai, are you with us?
Good morning, Xavier. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Now move on to Mrs. Janica Borg. Are you also with us? We can't hear you. Mrs. Borg, are you online? Can't see you, but I see Mr. Pim Visser from the European Association of Producer Organization. Good morning, Pim.
Good morning, Xavier. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly well.
All right, and I can't see myself, but you can see me, I think.
We can even see the sea from this point. Very good.
Thank you very much.
Now we'd like to pass the floor to Stuart Ross from the shipbuilding industry.
Yes, that's the European Community Ship Owners Association, EXA. And yes, I'm here. I hope you can hear and see me.
Yeah, perfectly well. Welcome, Stuart. And now just passing the floor to Cathy Hood from Vattenfall.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah. I'm just trying to get the camera working. Can you see me or not?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay. Just getting back to Mrs. Borg from WWF. Doesn't seem to be connected or hearing us. Okay, I will start still as we have quite a lot of this point to discuss, and I will just pass the floor directly to Kai Trumpler to present the perspective from a national point of view and authorities. Thank you, Kai.
Yes, thank you, and good morning again to everyone. It's nice to at least see some of you virtually again. Hi, Tom. Anyways, I thank the organizers for being asked to contribute the administration perspective on the sustainable management of maritime space and resources. And before I go on, I would just like to stress that this is strictly from the German point of view. Next slide, please. Right. As I was asked to be brief, I will focus just very quickly on spatial planning, some of the core planning issues we're dealing with, and then key points of the German experience. Next slide. So the German spatial planning for offshore wind is a multi-tiered planning system. We start at the top level with the maritime spatial plan and then go on to the site development plan that identifies specific areas. We then do site investigations and suitability assessment, and still at the end have a full project approval. And this is only the part of the planning that is being handled at my agency. There's the grid planning in particular is handled at the Bundesnetzagentur, the federal grid regulator. So there's more to this, but I'm going to focus on this part now. Next slide, please. So if we look at the top level, this is the maritime spatial plan for the German North Sea, EEZ, as it is in force right now. It's still from 2009, and you can see the major planning issues here that are being balanced are shipping, and offshore wind energy. And there's some regulations regarding Nature 2000 areas, such as there should be no wind turbines in there. Next slide. This is the current site development plan as it is in force right now, and you can see we go down to a very detailed level, and the orange areas are those that are supposed to be tendered out in the next rounds of tender for the federal grid regulator to tender out, and for construction in the year 2026 to 2030. However, this is the plan from last year, and there may be a substantial revision in targets, which necessitates a larger share of areas to be allocated. And next slide, please. So why are we doing this? And you've seen this from Mr. Helmedag already. We have the following principle. We have very far offshore located offshore turbines. They are then connected to an AC-DC converter that connects to shore via an DC cable that has at the moment a capacity of 900 megawatt and soon, or relatively soon, a capacity of up to 2 gigawatts. And next slide, please. However, as Mr. Helmedag has shown, really unlike that slide, the previous slide presents, the grid connection is not when you reach the shore, but is very far inland. So in particular, I can see in some of the areas of responsibility that actually Mr. Helmedag's company is addressing, you have grid connections that are longer from shore to the grid connection point than from the offshore wind farm to shore. Next slide, please. These are substantial investments that you can see. They are in the billions of euros per grid connection system, so it is vital that synchronization between offshore wind farm development and grid connection is ensured. Next slide, please. So what are our key concerns of when we do this planning and when we allocate space? One, of course, is international coherence. Yes, thank you. Next slide. That was correct. One, of course, is international coherence. And here you can see a section of the Baltic Sea, and we can see planning and maritime spatial plans from Sweden, Poland, Germany in the EZ, the German Land, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and draft plans from Denmark. And you can see it's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle, but we mostly managed to adjust this. Next slide, please. Another key concern is the environment. You can see here a section of the German North Sea, and in the slide on in the section on the left, you can see the distribution of divers before, and on the slide the distribution of divers after the construction of the wind farms that you see indicated there. And you can see it's a very condensed distribution afterward, and it was a much larger effect than we originally anticipated. Next slide, please. And so this is actually from a stakeholder meeting with environmental organizations, including the WWF, that I had on Tuesday this week. And you can see these indicate all the areas of concern that were highlighted by environmental stakeholders. And there were some more. So you can see there's always robust discussions on the allocation of space. Next slide, please. On the project level, I want to say we try to mitigate impacts on the marine environment, for example, by mandating noise mitigation measures. And you can see here bubble curtains and curtains that you may have heard about. It's always also a substantial part of the regulation on the project level. Next slide, please. Another key concern is shipping. Next slide. And you can see here, Germany is part of a very interconnected shipping system that goes in particularly through the Netherlands, Belgium, France, the Channel, out to the Atlantic, and connects basically the Atlantic, the North Sea, and the Baltic. And it's key that we ensure the integrity of this shipping system. Next slide. So to sum up, the key points of the German experience are the geography is key to our planning approach. I wouldn't go so far as to say geography is destiny, but it almost is in spatial planning. We have very limited space. The centers of electricity consumption are far away from the coast. There's a long distance grid connection with high investment costs necessary that requires a detailed and long-term planning to effectively use the space and ensure sync between grid connection and generating capacity. I want to re-emphasize again, particularly this is important for Germany, we have very limited space. Any reallocation of space from one use to another is a zero-sum game. There is, of course, a limited possibility for co-use, but really it is one of the major constraints that we are facing. And so personal observation, maybe we could think about more common guiding principles on how to allocate the space. For example, one could think about if the major target is climate change, really how much CO2 can we save with that square kilometer of space, just as an example. Other key planning concerns, of course, that we are facing is the international coherence, and here discussions in the Helcom WASA group, North Sea Energy Cooperation projects, international informal groups, and bilateral meetings help a lot. Shipping and the environment, and I do realize, of course, other countries may face more concerns, and there are other concerns that I have not mentioned here, notably fisheries and defense. Next slide, please. And here, thank you for playing that animation. And here you can see in the top left-hand corner indications of wind farms. And if you squint, you can tell, and if your connection is good enough, that you can that they actually are visible from space, because they dissipate clouds and have a little funnel effect on some of them. So already wind farms, we can see the wind farms that are installed right now, you can see from space affecting weathers. And of course, the context for this is large-scale wake effects and their possible effect on wind farm installation. And thank you. I'm sorry I'm a little bit over time.
Many thanks, Kai, for sharing with us the German experience and your expertise in this field. Is Mrs. Board online and able and willing to take it up from here?
Yes, I'm online.
Excellent. So the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. And sorry for the technical errors. I will stay off camera to be sure that there's enough bandwidth for you to hear me. Okay, so at WWF, our concern is with the space for nature in the marine spatial plans. These morning's presentations have shown that we do need a significant amount of more offshore wind energy in the marine areas to meet the targets set by the Paris Agreement. But I want to remind you what we're talking about. What offshore wind energy, where do we put it? Next slide, please. So this is the habitat, one example of the habitats that we have underwater, and this is what we need to coexist with when we start planning further offshore wind farm developments. Next slide, please. And just to set the scene from the underwater perspective, here you can see the SDG 14 targets. Some of them have deadlines for 2020. Some for 2025 and some for 2030. SDG 14 is the one about the underwater nature and how we deal with our oceans in the future. And from this graph, you can see that of those 5 targets that we should have met, 4 targets that we should have met by 2020, none of them show a green symbol. So one is orange, meaning that there's partial process on this one. That's to conserve at least 10% of the coastal and marine areas. But the other ones, the 3 other ones are not achieved and actually in quite a bad state. And if we look at the further targets down the line, you see that there's actually quite a gloomy picture being painted when we only look at what we're doing with our marine environments. So it's safe to say that there's quite a pressure on the marine environments today. And while we do completely agree that we need more offshore wind farm, we want to ensure that these further structures are made in an environmentally compatible manner and doing the least amount of harm that we can do to this already quite sensitive and stressed environment. Next slide, please. This slide is here to remind you that we already have a lot of legislation on the marine realm. This is all the European legislation we have for marine issues, ranging from directives and recommendations to, in the middle, you see different bodies working together on this. You will be able to study this more in detail when we share the slides after the presentation, but I want to highlight a few things for you. So we already have strategies on things. We have the MSP directive, which is circled there on the right-hand side. There is guidance on renewable energies. And of course, now we come out with the new offshore strategy this October. These directives and recommendations, different aspects of how we work together, they all link together, but unfortunately, although this picture shows you them all together, they don't always have a seamless collaboration. So there is some silo approach to how we deal with the marine environment. And it's very important that we break down these silos, that we don't keep working separate from each other, but that we have cross-sectoral cooperation, like here today when we're discussing these things together. Next slide, please. From WWF, we have given out 2 position papers this year with the focus on the marine environment and on marine spatial planning and especially on offshore wind farms. So to the left, you see the one called Offshore Wind Farms and Marine Protection in the North Sea, and the other one is called Achieving Ecosystem-Based Marine Spatial Plans. Next slide, please. To just quickly give you an overview of what we state in these position papers, which are available online, and I can post the links in the chat afterwards. Here you see the main bullet points. So the first thing we need to do when we want to use the marine environment for further development of EU, we have to make sure that the MPA network, the Marine Protected Area Network that we have in place, and that is still being developed, but this is an actual network that protects the marine environment. Unfortunately, a lot of the marine protected areas we have today are still paper parks, meaning that you have them nicely drawn on a map. It looks like there's a marine protected area, but when you go in and read the management plans and look at whether they are first and foremost even implemented, and secondly, what activities they allow, the situation looks pretty weak. Now, a marine protected area does not need to be a fully closed area with a fully no-go zone. No, you can actually have other activities taking place in the marine protected area. You can work around having activities there which would not harm the conservation efforts. So you have to, unfortunately, there's no one solution fits all. You have to go in a little bit case by case to make sure that whatever is being protected in one area, that is not being harmed for example, if we want to go in and make more offshore wind farms. As a starting point, WWF recommends that offshore wind farms are not built within MPAs. But there are cases where this can be done if you look at the coherence between the protection and conservation efforts in that area. Other points raised from these papers are cumulative impact assessments. They are very important, and these should cover the entire lifespan of new activities. So offshore wind farm construction, function, and decommission in an area is not the only activity taking place in these areas. The coastal areas in Europe are quite busy already, and it's very important that we look at the cumulative impacts of everything that's going on in the area. We are hopeful that best proven technology and further technological advances will bring nice efforts to this sector, that we have a future which looks even more brighter and bluer. And we also encourage that the precautionary principle is used when there is not enough information available about a certain area. Next slide, please. I'm going to take you through a case study, a short one. In the Latvian MSP process, they did an interesting approach with 4 different scenarios where they made their whole coastal OSP according to these 4 scenarios you can see here: economic growth, social well-being, resilient marine ecosystems, and the 4th one is development with a common space of the Baltic Sea region. So this is kind of a basin wide approach. Now, my red circle in there there is unfortunately fell on the wrong place. The two scenarios I'm going to take you through is the economic growth and the resilient marine ecosystem. And on the next slide, you can see these maps next to each other. I've chosen to show only the west coast of Latvia. There is more of Latvian waters, but this is the interesting part. So now if you look at these two pictures, which are next to each other, on the left-hand side you have the one plan, the marine spatial plan, where you would favor economic growth, and on the right-hand side you have the one which favors a resilient marine ecosystem. Well, you see both of them have shipping lanes portrayed here in pink and blue, and you see that both of them include offshore wind. That's the red squares. And on the left-hand side, you see some larger and more of the red squares than on the right-hand side. The MPAs are visible in both pictures in this shaded yellow. You see a large one there to the top of the picture. And they are, of course, the existing MPAs are the same in both pictures. But what's to be noted is that with the green squares, you can see the potential new MPAs. And on the resilient marine ecosystem scenario, you have more of this. You actually have new MPAs, whereas these are completely lacking in the left-hand picture on economic growth. For those of you who are wondering what the beige squares are next to the wind farms on the left-hand side picture, those are possible wave energy, future wave energy sites. So this quite theoretical example shows how our CUs can look quite different depending on what we emphasize. And naturally, a balanced approach between these two would be what's good. I show these pictures to show you that really we would have no new MPAs and no new protected areas if we only favor economic growth. So it's important to find a balance between these two approaches. Next slide, please. So a few bullet points to wrap it up, and a few points I want to highlight. In these discussions about offshore wind and new offshore wind farms and offshore wind energy, I've been very pleased to hear the green approach, the blue approach to building this sector. But at the same time, sometimes I feel like jumps are taken to very eagerly talk about new nature. I keep hearing that the actual wind farm structures can function as new kind of, having this artificial reef effect with animals settling on them, and that is true. There is positive effects of building such structures. But what I need to highlight from a pure marine ecologist perspective is that new nature can never replace existing nature. And it's an added value. But if we go into a site and start building an offshore wind farm structure, there will be disruption, which we will need to minimize together while this building phase is taking place. And it's very important to see that whatever new nature that settles afterwards, we have to compare that to the previously existing nature in the site. So just to be mindful that nature, underwater nature is not equally comparable. There are many different habitats, and they all have their own role in how the ecosystem works. We also don't want to make our different types of habitats very homogenic. So we don't want to have a lot of the same habitats. The basis for a resilient and well-functioning ecosystem is that we have a wide variety of different habitats. So, next slide. To go to our recommendations.
If you could wrap up in order to leave some time for the other speakers, and maybe we'll have time during the question and answer to develop further. Thanks a lot. Sorry.
I will wrap up. Yes, I will wrap up. I can leave this as my last slide. So, already mentioned about the MPAs to be kept outside. The offshore wind farms to be kept outside MPAs. When we plan wind farms, there are a few spatial and temporal environmental factors to think about. I have another slide for them, but please don't go to that slide yet. You get to read it when I share the slides. Two main points to finish off with. We have to invest in new environmentally friendly technologies and energy saving schemes, and we have to make sure that there's robust and appropriate independent monitoring of impacts when we go into developing further offshore wind farms. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and sorry again about this. There's a lot to say and many speakers and a limited time, but this is the start of a conversation, certainly not the end of it. Before I pass on to Pim Visser, just to recall you that if you have questions, you can send it through the chat to the moderator that will send them to me and to us. Pim, we can see you with the sea at the back, the floor, and the mic is yours. Welcome.
Good morning. I'll try to stick to my 5 minutes.
Yes, if you could. Thanks a lot.
There's two European umbrella organizations in fisheries, EuroPesh, founded in 1960, and EAPO, founded in 1980. EAPO represents 38 producer organizations from 10 member states. We represent about 10,000 fishing vessels and 3.5 million tons of landings into the European markets for food supply, which has a 3 billion first sale value. It's a European organization, and for anybody who wants to speak with the European fishing industry, EuroPesh and EAPO, who work together very closely, are the one-stop shop. Next slide, please. What I told you is that we represent 10,000 vessels, but these are vessels which are very in size and in type of fisheries. From very small scale fisheries, most of the membership of the EAPO POs are small scale fishers, to the large factory trawlers which stay at sea for over 6 weeks, but all fishing for human consumption. That is most important. Next slide, please. But if we talk about fishing, and if we talk about fishing activities and about impacts, we're talking about the impact on their families. 95% of the fishing companies in Europe are small scale and small and medium enterprises, fathers and sons, grandfathers and grandsons. So we don't talk about big industrial complexes, although all these boats are being branded as industrial fisheries. They are small companies, family-owned companies. Next slide, please. And as I said, we are producing for a growing population worldwide, both in Western Europe and in Africa worldwide. Next slide, please. And we are now talking about the sustainability goals of the UN and about wind farm. And the sustainability is a three-legged stool. It has the environment, society, and economy. And we can't just talk about one of the three pillars of the stool independently. No, they go hand in hand, they go together. We can't have good economy without good environment, and we can't have a good environment without the societal impact. Next slide, please. This says thank you, but I'm not finished yet. If we look to the spatial use of the sea until the mid-20th century, it was very simple. There was three usages of the sea: trade, fishing, and war about trade and fishing. It was a simple situation, but that has changed dramatically, as we've seen in the slides of the previous speakers. Fishing, which unfortunately was not so much mentioned in the previous slides by the previous speakers, is a nomadic operation. Our members hunt for the fish depending on the season, the wind, the tide, and the temperature. There is no fixed fishing fields or fishing meadows. Fishing requires space. And if we look at the North Sea, most impact on the North Sea fishing activities over the past decades have been the increase of shipping lanes, mines, bombs and ammunition dumps, oil and gas development, and in recent years, the planning of large marine protected areas. They have all added to the burden, with wind at sea as the newest kid on the block. And as we have seen, and as we see at sea, we are only just at the beginning of the development of wind at sea. Fishing is an activity with a relatively small impact on the GDP, so economically it's not a huge activity. But fishing is of utmost importance for fishing communities in rural areas. And a rule of thumb says that every fisherman at sea creates about 5 jobs on land, in logistics, fish trade, processing, service and maintenance, especially in the maritime sector. In the North Sea, the fishing activities are managed through the Common Fisheries Policy and are increasingly being influenced by environmental regulations such as the MSFD, Natura 2000 and IMO measures. Large-scale wind developments result in fisheries de facto being banned from an area, depending on the national jurisdiction. The UK has the most liberal regime, with Belgium and Germany at the other side of the spectrum. In the UK, wind farms fishing is fully allowed, and in the Belgium and the German area, parks there is no fishing. And that's the same for the stakeholder involvement. The UK is on the most involved side, and Belgium and Germany are using a top-down approach. The insurance of fishing operations in wind farms, so for the security, is proving to be increasingly problematic. So if you can fish in a wind farm, but you can't have insurance for your boat and your crew, you are also you are also de facto being banned. We need to talk about knowledge, and wind farms are being developed and operated without any proper research on the effect of noise during construction and the noise during operation on spawning fish aggregation, as well as on flatfish on the seabed and on sea mammals. There's no research, and it's a myth that wind farms will become a safe haven for ever declining fish stocks. First of all, in this field, independent ICES research shows that the fish stocks are not declining, but increasing outside the wind farms, and we need to have thorough, sturdy research inside the wind farm. And some of them have, and the experience of, for instance, UK fishers give us the impression that it's not so good for fish inside the wind farm as outside the wind farm. Therefore, the fishing industry is hugely worried about the effects of changing currents, changing silt dispositions, changing wind patterns, and other meteorological effects. And the big question, if anything goes wrong, who can be held accountable for all these negatives? And the big question is also what will be done to mitigate and reverse these negatives. To conclude, I call upon authorities and developers on wind farms to greatly increase the research into the large-scale ecosystem effects before taking further irreversible steps with a possible devastating impact on both the fish and the fisheries and the underwater nature. And I call upon wind farm developers and spatial planners to fully and truly engage with the fishing industry in all respects. Otherwise, if that's not the case, you will be organizing your own resistance from the fishing industry, and all our energy should be used in stakeholder engagement and not wasted in fighting each other. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Pim, for sharing with us the perspective from the fisheries. Now I would like to move to Mr. Ross and from the European Community Shipholders Association.
Yes, thank you very much. In this presentation, I will focus mostly on shipping and offshore wind as part of broader renewables sector. But just first of all, as an introduction to EXA, if you can go to the next slide, please. EXA is, as you said, the European Community Shipowners Association, representing 20 national shipowners associations from EU member states, the UK and Norway. And the membership covers shipping vessels across all trades, but also including the vessels involved in constructing and maintaining offshore wind farms. We're a secretariat based in Brussels. And the next slide, please. So indeed, today I wanted to mention the perspectives of offshore wind and shipping, and also hopefully some shared opportunities. Next slide. So the first perspective is the role of ships in enabling offshore wind farms and related infrastructure to be constructed and maintained and eventually decommissioned. The second perspective, which I'd also address, is the need for coexistence between shipping more generally, but also the infrastructure at sea. And third, hopefully conclude on some points on the future offshore renewable strategy and some ideas from a shipping perspective. Next slide, please. So the first perspective to mention here is that ships are highly involved across the full project lifecycle of an offshore wind farm. There's around about 18 different types of vessels used across the life cycle, from the surveying of sites in the early phases to the installation of cables, foundations, turbines, transfer of technicians, maintenance facilities, and eventually the decommissioning of the sites. So ships are highly involved, and because offshore wind has been, until recently, mostly located in Europe, European shipping companies have developed quite some expertise in this field. And one thing that we would like to see in this strategy is to emphasize the role of maintaining that competitiveness as the sector grows around Europe, but also internationally. Second slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so the next perspective really is, of course, that shipping as a broad sector also needs to coexist with offshore wind. And we know that there is a need to manage what may increasingly be a more crowded sea space, not just with offshore wind, but also all the many other sea users. We've heard many already this morning. And for shipping, this coexistence is mostly about ensuring coherence with existing maritime transport routes, traffic separation schemes, and of course ensuring safety, maneuverability, and competitiveness of shipping as a green transport mode. So of course this planning has to be done well, and even also take into consideration future trends in possibly new trading patterns. We could think about the Northern Sea route for one example, but also just changing density of traffic, deeper draft vessels, longer, wider vessels. But on the other hand, also the increasing distance between wind turbines. So I think planning, it's not done today and finished tomorrow, but rather a process. Next slide, please. And so just thinking about how to manage this need for coexistence, I think the first point to make is that at the approval stage of offshore wind farm development, a thorough front loading of the licensing procedure would be a very good process. I'm sure that takes place, but ensuring a navigational risk assessment before projects are approved would seem to be one starting point. And so would early and cross-border consultation with all of the different maritime space stakeholders, including shipping, but also the many others. And this also needs to be coherent internationally. And in the European context, we have, of course, the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, which seems to be a good instrument to bring different parties together. And as offshore wind grows, perhaps this directive could be a good mechanism for ensuring that the experience of offshore wind and coexistence, primarily in the North Sea, can be applied as the technology is expanded further afield. And there are some safety considerations to mention here. The provision of vessel traffic information services, ensuring coverage within wind farm areas, requirement of navigational aids, lights and markings on wind farms, and potentially also the provision of emergency support vessels within the vicinity of wind farms. The next slide, please. And To conclude and to think a bit more about the offshore renewables strategy, which we're expecting in October, and to hear a little bit more today, the first point I want to make is that because of this competence that has been established in Europe among shipping companies, but also many other related companies around the sector, would be to ensure that the strategy can help keep the first mover advantage that European companies hold here. And we know that there are already projects, for example, in floating offshore wind, which is clearly a good way to keep innovation in Europe. But concerning shipping, other examples could be research and development or pilot project schemes towards zero or low emission vessels involved in the sector, some of which are relatively small and not traveling too far from the coast, so could be good test examples for alternative fuels or energy sources. And so with this innovation that exists and can be built on in Europe, another major priority could be ensuring that this competitiveness can be used internationally outside of Europe, and that European shipping companies have access to these growing markets around the world for offshore wind. Also looking at time, but to mention one big possible win-win scenario for both shipping and offshore wind, which has been mentioned by other speakers, is the relationship between offshore wind and the creation of green hydrogen, which for the shipping sector could help to unlock one major fuel source to help decarbonization objectives be met. Next slide, please. And so I hope in this brief presentation that I've helped to, or I've described how shipping enables offshore wind, can coexist with it, and that between the two there can be plenty of win-win opportunities. And we hope that the future strategy can help to realize some of these. So thanks very much for having us present here.
Many thanks, Mr. Ross, for keeping the time for this interesting and diverse presentation, touching on many of the services and work you're doing as the shipping industry. Now, I'm very pleased to pass the floor and the microphone to Mrs. Wood, presenting Vattenfall. Welcome.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, yep. Perfectly.
Yeah, excellent. Hi, I'm Catherine Word. I'm head of consenting for offshore wind in Vattenfall, and I'm here to basically substantiate a lot of what's been said today in relation to opportunities in maritime spatial planning, specifically in relation to freeing up areas for offshore wind. Next slide, please. So a bit about Vattenfall. We're one of Europe's largest producers of electricity and heat, and we're a leading offshore wind developer. We're 100% owned by the Swedish state, and we operate in 5 main markets: Sweden, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, and the UK. So in these markets, we develop and operate offshore wind farms, and you may have read in the news that we recently gained consent for Norfolk Vanguard, a 1.8 gigawatt wind farm, and once built, this will be one of the largest wind farms in the world. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've seen this number a lot today. According to the European Commission's own estimates, we're going to need up to 450 gigawatts of offshore wind to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So how do we achieve this? Well, Vattenfall has identified 5 pillars that we believe should be reflected in your upcoming strategy. The first one is space, to build the projects, then infrastructure, specifically grid, a good investment framework, a robust consenting procedure, and as we've just discussed, system integration. So basically things like renewable hydrogen coupled with offshore wind. Next slide, please. So focusing on space, how are we going to find room for this 450 gigawatts? From an initial consideration of, say, the North Sea, space doesn't really seem to be at a premium. However, if you read the 2019 Wind Europe report, this estimates that greater than 50% of the North Sea is currently not suitable for offshore wind farms due to the myriad of existing activities such as fishing, shipping, military and environmental designations. So our marine environment is already extremely busy, as I hope to illustrate in the following slides. Next slide. So this is an area off the UK's east coast, and if the person in charge of the slides can just start to layer on the activities, and I'll just explain the different activities as we go. So here we've got aggregate dredging, and then shipping channels, cables, so telecommunications and electricity. And then we've got oil and gas, including pipelines. And then the green areas are offshore wind farms. And then the blue rectangles shows fishing density. And then lastly, the pink areas are Natura 2000. Just to note, this is mapping for the UK only. It's not like the Netherlands has got much more space. So as you can see, we're going to need a major mind shift is needed to enable us to free up space for the offshore wind growth that is required for our future decarbonised society. And as part of this mind shift, we believe that we really need to recognise the central role of offshore wind as the backbone for electrification, and also really start to work together better to identify co-use opportunities on a much broader scale, thereby maximising the space that is available. So those industries that have been operating in the sea area for decades, they really need to be brought into this change agenda. And it's really encouraging to hear Stuart talk about his thoughts on shipping, and really be encouraged by Europe and national governments with societal backing to find win-win solutions. So given the time available, I'm going to just provide 2 examples of what is being achieved, but obviously there's still a lot more to do. Next slide, please. So the first example is co-location with defence radar operations. So here at Vattenfall, one of our staff is leading a collegiate approach, bringing together really senior representatives from defence, the wider government and offshore wind under the UK government's offshore wind sector deal. None of it is rocket science. We need a proactive and collaborative mindset. We need the involvement of real leaders and decision makers in the process, and a real will to find solutions and act on them. We'd encourage you to review this model and consider it for other marine industries such as shipping and fishing. Next slide, please. Our second example is in relation to co-location with economic sectors. And this is perhaps more challenging. So here at Vattenfall, we're proactively working to find sustainable solutions for co-use with offshore wind farms. And we've got examples here of seaweed cultivation and some diversification opportunities for fishermen. So in comparison to the defence example, what these examples lack is a same level of top leadership. And therefore, such initiatives tend to be undertaken often by individuals in a very piecemeal approach. So we would argue that as a society, we need to really recognise and share these opportunities and move towards a much larger scale strategic approach with the backing of organisations who have suitable vision and resources. Next slide, please. So in summary, in order to provide the significant volumes of offshore wind required to meet our climate change targets, we basically need more areas of sea opened up for renewables. And within maritime spatial planning, we really need to recognise the importance of offshore wind, rethink the future with renewables as a central element of the activities considered, and move away from the kind of more traditional approach where offshore wind is sort of fitted between the gaps, to one where we free up optimal areas for what we believe is an essential industry. So with the support of the EU and national governments, we believe this should be coupled with strategic leadership from all sectors to look for multi-partner approaches and look for multi-use opportunities. Any questions?
Many thanks, Kathy, for this very interesting presentation as well. We will take some extra minutes to be able to run some discussion and question and answer. And I will ask one question per speaker, starting with Mr. Kai Trumpler. A question that came up about the wake effect, Kai. Does it mean that there may be less space available that was what was first thought maybe some years ago, and does this have as an implication on offshore energy targets? if you, I know I've been discussing this with you, and this is a very interesting and complex issue, but if you could try to keep it within 1-2 minutes. Thank you, Guy.
Yes, thank you, Xavier. Unfortunately, you did cut out for a little bit, but I think you asked me to elaborate a little bit on the wake effect. Is that correct, right?
Yes, sorry about it. Yes, about the wake effect, about now the knowledge we have on the analysis you've been running in Germany. Does it have an impact about the space available compared with what really was considered some years ago, and about the offshore energy targets? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I'll gladly say a couple of words to this, but first of all, to say to Mr. Alward directly, I'm sorry if I was a little bit curt in the chat. I'm not. This is not my preferred medium of conversation. If this came across as like weird, I'm actually genuinely want to talk to you about this, and I would be very happy if you could approach us, and we'd be very happy to put you in contact with the right officials at the ministry if we can't do the answer ourselves. Let me get that out of the way. The other thing is, yes, wake effects. We have seen in the last, in particular, last 1 or 2 years, that there are wake effects beyond the scale of the wind farm that may adversely impact generation capacity. So, for example, some models for Germany assumed we could have a up to 4,300, 4,500 full capacity hours, and with wake effects and a significant buildup of energy, this goes down in very conservative estimates to 3,600. And you can see that while the headline number of installed capacity remains the same, the overall produced energy and hence the CO2 reduction is significantly impacted. And we have, as of yet, not enough information to say how that will affect maybe North Sea or sea basin wide the production, but it is definitely an issue that we need to consider and take into consideration, in particular when we talk about developments that affect an area like as dense as the southern North Sea. I hope that's about as all I can do in that short time, that short amount of time.
Yeah, we are aware there's much more that could be said on this issue as most of the points we raised today. But again, that's the beginning of conversation, certainly not the end of it. I will now move to, thank you, Kai. I will now move to Mrs. Bohr for WWF. Here the question is about marine protected areas and offshore wind. So you made it quite clear that offshore wind should not be built in marine protected areas. But what about supporting infrastructures, cables, operation and maintenance vessels that may be passing by and crossing maritime protected areas? Do you have been running? Do you have some views you'd like to share with us on this issue? Thank you.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. Supporting infrastructure like this can in some cases be compatible with MPAs, especially with MPAs where there's zonation. So in the more flexible zones, you can have activities like this. It depends on the conservation objectives. So if we are conserving a sensitive sandbank, then putting a cable through that sensitive sandbank is not a good idea. But if we are conserving another species that will not be highly disturbed by the cable laying operation, and well, the subsequent use of the cable is usually not that disturbing. So these two things can in that case coexist.
Okay, so rather a case-by-case analysis as well. Thanks a lot. I will now move to Pim. A question about competition between stakeholders and different sea users. In your view, what could be done to improve co-use of the sea in Europe, and what are you expecting in particular as initiative or action that could be initiated by the European Union?
Thank you for that question, Xavier. and if you look at the North Sea, and the North Sea is one of the examples because it's a shallow sea, it's highly productive in fisheries, and it's an interesting area for wind farms. So how can we coexist? The European fisheries policy is a common policy, but spatial planning is not a common policy. So there is member state rules, regulation, engagement, stakeholder engagement, etc. And I think it would be, it's most, we all wish that there is more international stakeholder consultation. And I would call upon everybody to use the body of the advisory councils more. There's a Baltic Sea Advisory Council, North Sea Advisory Council with spatial planning working groups where NGOs, fishing industry and other stakeholders come together to discuss all the items. In the Netherlands, we've just agreed a North Sea agreement with shipping and the maritime industry, NGOs, energy, government, part of the fishing industry, to have a institutionalized table of discussions. So we need to engage because there's more and more use of the sea and less space. And as I said, fisheries requires space. So I'm not too happy with the dogmatic approach by the NGOs that an MPA should not be used for renewable energy, because if everybody is sticking to his or her usage of the sea, we need 5 North Seas and we have only one, so multi-use is a necessity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Pim. Now moving to Stuart, a question about employment and business opportunity. So could you tell us a bit about jobs creation in your sector related to the development of offshore wind, and what could be the future trends? Thank you.
I must say that's quite a difficult question for me to answer. I don't have any data to hand. But I do think that one of our members has done some work on this, and I will check on that, and I will contact you, Xavier, and maybe the presentation of that can be shared to the participants. I think there has been some work done there, but I don't have any data to hand, so I'm afraid I can't answer that.
Okay, which certainly we'd be happy to follow up and share information that you could share with us. Thank you, Stuart. And now moving to Cathy Hood. Let me get back to the question I had. Sorry about this. Just give me a second. Processing several things. Yes, it's about information and public acceptance. How do you address this at the different phase of the project development? Probably early stage, during construction, operation, afterwards, and what, from your experience, what are the most critical stage within the stakeholder engagement and public information?
Wow, that was a big topic.
Yes,
I mean, we really aim to involve stakeholders in the process right from the start. So we'd have technical stakeholder consultation. We often use a thing called the evidence plan process, which is a way of getting technical stakeholders around the table to agree the types of data we need to collect. Because I think a lot of the issues with the marine protected areas, a lot of the precaution is based on lack of data and lack of information. And we could perhaps take a less precautionary approach once we collected more data to give people like WWF more reassurance about the impacts. In terms of the kind of general stakeholders, like the general public, again, we start that right at the start. We'd have open meetings. We're doing more webinars to get people involved. We'd send out newsletters. I mean, and the thing we're doing a lot more of now is trying to educate the public in terms of what the opportunities are for them. So having education, we're going into schools, basically talking to young children about what the opportunities are for them, and maybe that will change the way that the exams they'll take and the path they'll go down. We talked to small and medium enterprises about whether they can get involved with the large tier 1 suppliers and really contribute. So we're trying to bring socio-economic benefit to the local area where we build a wind farm. And then often in terms of the visual impacts, we do a lot of photo montages to explain, you know, what predominantly for offshore wind, what the onshore infrastructure will look like. So yeah, it's I would say we start stakeholder engagement from day one and keep it going throughout the project and really see it as an educational opportunity, a socio-economic opportunity. And like I say, when we're dealing with technical stakeholders looking for win-wins, it's been really interesting that Stuart's talking about hydrogen-powered vessels. You know, how can we work with people like the shipping industry to really, yeah, find some good solutions.
Many thanks for this contribution, Kathy. We have now reached the end of this session. I think was a lot of content, much more could be developed on that, and I'm sure this is a discussion that will stay and that will gather all of us for the coming months and year. Thanks a lot for joining us. I saw as well that there was some active discussion on the chat. That couldn't follow it all, but we will. Thanks a lot for our speakers to accept and join us and bring their expertise and views. And have a very good day, all of you. Bye-bye for now.